In the year 587 before the Common Era, the Babylonians invaded Jerusalem and took about 90% of the population into captivity 800 miles to the east. The exiles yearned to return, and they began to believe in the power of Zion, the idea that they had a homeland where they should be. We find this in biblical literature, especially of that time. For example, in Jeremiah. Jeremiah wrote them from Jerusalem, and he said, I will turn, in the name of God, he said, I will turn your captivity and gather you from among all the nations and from all the places where I have driven you. I will bring you back to the place from which I caused you to be carried away captive. Jeremiah is promising that they're going to go home. In Psalm 137, we find a plaint, a very emotional statement. By the rivers of Babylon we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you. If I do not set Jerusalem above my most chief joy. And in Psalm 126, when the Lord brought back those who returned to Zion, we were like those who dreamed. Turn our captivity, O Lord, as the streams in the dry land. They who sow in tears shall reap in joy. This notion that Zion, or Jerusalem, is the center of Jewish life was key over the centuries. Even though Jews frequently could not live there, or in most cases did not live there, they remembered the Holy Land in their prayers every day. Jewish prayer from the beginning of the Common Era has emphasized a return to Zion. Just one example. In one of the morning prayers you have, let our eyes behold your loving return to Zion. Blessed are you, Adonai, whose presence returns to Zion. Perhaps the most powerful Zionist impulse was in poetry. And of those poems, those by Yehuda Halevi, Judah the Levite, in the 11th century, were really the key. Yehuda Halevi wrote defenses of Jewish life. And in one of his poems, he wrote the following: My heart is in the east, and I in the uttermost west. He lived in Spain. How can I find savor in food? How shall it be sweet to me? How shall I render my vows and my bonds, while yet Zion lies beneath the fetter of Edom, and I in Arab chains? A light thing would it seem to me to leave all the good things of Spain, seeing how precious in my eyes the dust of the desolate sanctuary. Well, Yehuda Halevi eventually did move to the land that he wanted, and he died there in 1141. All of these early Zionist ideas were religious. The idea that God is most available near Jerusalem. There was never a thought that they should actually do something affect a Jewish return, much less create a Jewish state in Palestine. This was way beyond anything that they could think of when they were dispersed in Muslim and Christian lands in North Africa, in the Middle East, and in Europe. But the 19th century brought a change, a major change. Key to this was the growth of nationalism in other countries. The idea that each people had a right to its own country. This was true in South and Central America from about 1820 on. And we ought to note the importance of Simón Bolívar in this regard. Greece split from the Ottoman Empire about the same time. In the 1860s, Italy under Giuseppe Mazzini and Giuseppe Garibaldi found its independence and unified all the small states of Europe. And at the same time, Germany's 60-some principalities were unified by Otto von Bismarck. So we have this notion that states should be created for people of a common heritage and a common destiny. Jewish European thinkers took up the same notion. Moses Hess, in 1862, wrote a book called Rome and Jerusalem. Leo Pinsker wrote a book called Auto-Emancipation 20 years later. And Theodor Herzl, at the turn of the century, wrote a book called The Jewish State. There were periodicals that often spoke to the idea of creating a Jewish universe or country or society. And they all had this same common idea, that it was time for the exiles, wherever they were, to ingather into a land in Zion at the end of the Mediterranean and to create some kind of Jewish civilization and culture. Now, why, one might ask, was there all of a sudden this new political interest among Jews? Well, we've already remarked about the miserable conditions the Jews lived in Eastern Europe. They got worse. And in 1881 and 2, a series of pogroms, riots by Cossacks and others, non-Jewish people, against Jews, were encouraged by the Tsarist regime. It was a nice way of deflecting concern for the bad conditions in Russia from the government and blaming it on the Jews. Now, the Jews had a number of options. Some decided they would stay and just tough it out, that the Messiah would come and save them. But others decided it was time to leave. And so you find small Jewish communities established in Central and South America, in South Africa, in Australia, in the US and Canada. The US and Canada, of course, were the primary ports of refuge. Roughly 2.5 million Jews came to these shores between 1882 and 1924. Some, of course, also went to Palestine. About 110,000 Jews during this period left. Some went back to Russia because conditions in Palestine for Jews were really very difficult. It was hard life. And they also had the animosity of the Arab population because the Arabs thought they were going to be displaced. In Russia, there was a movement called the Hakshara, the preparatory movement. And young Jews who lived in urban settings would go out into the country for retreats, sometimes during the week, sometimes just for weekends, and they would practice things like agriculture and animal husbandry to get ready to move to the Promised Land and take up residence on an agricultural settlement. Even the Jews who did not move to Israel or to Palestine were imbued with the Zionist notion. They couldn't go there, or they didn't go there, but they believed that that was something very important to them. Now, the early American Zionists, way before this, adopted a philosophy of securing a place in the land of Israel or Palestine, after 1882, it assumed a greater place. It assumed a place as a possible refuge for those who were driven out of Eastern Europe by the pogroms. But earlier in the United States, there had been echoes of this same notion. Mordechai Emanuel Noah, one of the most colorful people ever to live in the Jewish community of North America, was a journalist, a playwright, a politician, a diplomat. He was undoubtedly the most important Jew in America in the 1820s and 30s. He was one of the founders of New York University. He projected a New York Jewish hospital, and in 1850, that hospital was formed as Jews Hospital. It was renamed very shortly, 2 years later, as Mount Sinai, because Jews Hospital sounded too Jewish to some of the people. In 1825, Mordechai Emanuel Noah set up an ideal community for Jews on an island near Buffalo in the St. Lawrence River, an island called Grand Isle, and he named the place Ararat. That was the place, of course, where Noah came down after the flood. And he failed, unfortunately, to attract Jewish settlers. It just didn't work. And Noah came to the realization that after 3,000 years or 2,500 years of talking about going back to Jerusalem, the only place that would motivate Jews to move to a refuge was creating something in the land of Israel. And he became one of the earliest Zionists of America. After the pogroms of 1882 in Eastern Europe, conditions of life became literally untenable. It was a disaster, and it was dangerous, and it was intolerable. Jews who came to the United States fleeing from persecution brought with them the Zionist dream. Even if they did not go to Palestine, the dream persisted. And so one of the ways they did this was to create utopian Jewish communities in America, because they also were often socialists, and they believed in communal living. The kibbutzim in Israel and in America began to develop at the same time, and nobody knows exactly, but it's estimated that perhaps 50,000 people lived on common settlements in American agricultural places. Some of them were, for example, Sicily Island in Louisiana in 1881, or Crimea, South Dakota in 1882. The same year, New Odessa in Oregon. 2 years later, Beersheba in Kansas. Almost all of these settlements lasted for a very short time. One of them, interestingly enough, was near Chicago and is under the runways today of O'Hare Airport. There were two that did succeed, both of them in New Jersey, Woodbine and Vineland, and they became agricultural settlements of truck farming. Truck farming was very simple. You raised a crop of vegetables, you put it on a truck, and you drove to market, either in Philadelphia or in New York especially, and you sold your produce right out of the truck. And these settlements continue today with a significant Jewish population. But nearly all Jews who came to America were urban. They settled in cities because they had access to services, to friends, to support that they needed, to commonality. By the end of the 19th century, the Zionist movement was beginning to affect these people. Theodor Herzl, had already in 1897 held a conference in Basel, Switzerland, of Zionist representatives. And American Zionists felt impelled to organize a parallel movement to the international organization. And so the Federation of American Zionists was organized in 1901, and it became, in 1917, it changed its name to the Zionist Organization of America, which is still what it's known as. What was the central philosophy? Very simple. Most American Jews by this time had no intention of moving to Palestine. Some did. My own wife's grandfather moved to a farm outside Cincinnati, Ohio, and he was thinking of going to Israel. He did, in fact, move there briefly, but found it was just too difficult. He came back and farmed and raised vegetables, and his sons went into the vegetable business selling vegetables and fruit. But they wanted to support the Jewish homeland for two reasons. The first is philanthropic. This was going to be a refuge for oppressed Jews. It was a place where somebody could flee and find a reception that was hospitable and make a new life. The second reason was that they understood that a Jewish homeland would have an effect on Jewish culture and life everywhere. Eliezer ben Yehuda, for example, began to speak modern Hebrew. And today, the way we pronounce Hebrew in almost every community is derivative from what ben Yehuda did in Tel Aviv in the early part of the 20th century. So these were American Jewish motivations. And we find two people in America who were very significant in helping these motivations develop. They were surprising people, at least one. The first I want to introduce you to is Louis Dembitz Brandeis. Brandeis, of course, was born in Kentucky to an old and prominent Jewish German family. They were not Zionists. In fact, they opposed Zionism because America is our Zion, and there was a concern in those circles about acceptance by their neighbors and a charge of divided loyalty. If there's a war, who are you going to fight for, Israel or America? Brandeis was brilliant. He altogether skipped college and went to Harvard Law School, where he graduated at the age of 19. He was a lawyer. He worked with labor and progressive social causes. In 1912, he moderated strikes by garment workers in New York City. And he was moved, as he talked to these workers, by their Zionist rhetoric and passion. He became empathetic. He felt what they felt and understood what they were talking about. He began to read Zionist literature and eventually became converted to being a proponent of some kind of Jewish settlement in the Middle East. He became the leading spokesman for the cause and was the president of the ZOA from its founding until 1920. In 1915, he had addressed the Central Conference of American Rabbis. Now, that's the body of Reform rabbis, and at that point in history, they were generally opposed to Zionism. There were a few who were not, but generally they were negative. And this is what he said. This is a long quote, but I think it's worth reading. The Zionists seek to establish their home in Palestine because they are convinced that the undying longing of the Jews for Palestine is a fact of deepest significance, that it is a manifestation in the struggle for existence by an ancient people which has established its right to live, a people whose 3,000 years of civilization has produced a faith culture and individuality which enable it to contribute largely to the future, as it has in the past, to the advance of civilization. and that it is not a right merely but a duty of the Jewish nationality, and notice he calls us a nation, to survive and develop. They believe, the Zionists believe, that only in Palestine can Jewish life be fully protected from the forces of disintegration, that there alone can the Jewish spirit reach its full and natural development, and that by securing for those Jews who wish to settle there the opportunity to do so, not only those Jews but all other Jews will be benefited, and that the long, perplexing Jewish problem will at last find solution. The Jewish problem, of course, was anti-Semitism. And then he addressed the rabbis, and he wanted to reassure them of something very important, that the ideals and values of Americans and Zionists are identical. So he said, let no American imagine that Zionism is inconsistent with patriotism. Multiple loyalties are objectionable only when they are inconsistent. Every American Jew who aids in the advancing the Jewish settlement in Palestine, though he feels that neither he nor his descendants will ever live there, will likewise be a better man and a better American for doing so. There is no inconsistency between loyalty to America and loyalty to Judaism, or Jewry. Brandeis was an amazing man. Of course, he was also a justice of the Supreme Court and a very, very important Zionist leader in the early days. The other person I want to introduce you to is a woman, Henrietta Zold. Henrietta was independent of her Zionist career, which was very important. She established new parameters for what women could do in America and in American Jewish society. She was born the daughter of a liberal rabbi, Benjamin Zold, in Baltimore, and she grew up with outstanding general and Jewish education. She persuaded Solomon Schechter at the Jewish Theological Seminary to allow her to take classes in Jewish thought and practice and literature, but only with the condition that she would never apply to be ordained as a rabbi. She never married. She established the first English as a second language school for Jewish Russian immigrants in Baltimore. She edited the American Jewish Yearbook, part of the Jewish Encyclopedia, and the Talmudic Dictionary that was published by Marcus Jastrow. She attended Herzl's first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897 and was elected to the Executive Committee of the Federation of American Zionists early on. In 1912, she founded an organization called Hadassah. Hadassah is another name for Esther in the Bible, a woman of considerable passion and power. This was the women's parallel of the Zionist Organization of America, and it's now the largest women's organization in the world. Her goal was philanthropy, health care in Palestine for both Jews and Arabs, eventually a hospital, and a preventive care network. She was very interested in nursing and health. In 1933, the crisis in Germany prompted Henrietta Zold to found a new organization called Youth Aliyah to bring endangered young people to safety in Palestine, and then eventually, as things got worse, to anywhere in the world where they could find refuge from the Nazis. Henrietta Zold represents a remarkable forward step for women and for the Zionist movement in America. The early Zionist activities in the United States were intended to open opportunities for oppressed Jews elsewhere, but not for Jews already in the United States. It was for them and not for us. American Zionists understood that their activities would mirror American values of democracy, opportunity, equality, and caring for those in need elsewhere. And that is the beginning of the Zionist movement in America.